There's a moment in every awakened person's life when they meet someone who feels impossibly familiar. Not familiar like you've seen them before, but familiar like you've known them across lifetimes. Your soul recognizes something in theirs that defies logic, transcends explanation, and shakes you to your very core. Carl Jung spent decades studying these profound encounters between souls. What he discovered will change everything you thought you knew about love, destiny, and the invisible forces orchestrating your most meaningful connections. This isn't about romance or finding your perfect match. This is about something far more mysterious and transformative. Jung uncovered that certain meetings between souls are orchestrated by forces operating beyond conscious awareness. These encounters aren't random. They're not coincidence. They're part of a vast psychological process that's been guiding human connections since the beginning of consciousness itself. Today I'm revealing Jung's hidden teaching about what happens when two souls are meant to meet, the signs that reveal these destined encounters, the psychological forces that draw certain souls together across time and space, and why these meetings often feel like coming home and being completely terrified at the same time. If you've ever met someone who seemed to see straight through to your essence, who triggered both profound recognition and intense discomfort, who made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself, Jung would say you've experienced one of these archetypal encounters. And what I'm about to share will explain why it happened and what it means for your psychological evolution. Here's what Jung discovered that shatters our understanding of human connection. Most people think we meet others randomly, that attraction is based on personality or appearance, that love is just chemistry and compatibility. Jung saw through this surface-level understanding to something far more profound. He realized that our most significant encounters are orchestrated by what he called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is like a vast underground river flowing beneath all human experience. It contains archetypal patterns, ancient wisdom, and organizing principles that exist beyond individual awareness. And when two souls are meant to meet, this deeper intelligence arranges their encounter through what Jung termed synchronicity. Synchronicity isn't just meaningful coincidence. It's the universe's way of revealing that inner and outer reality are intimately connected. When two souls are destined to encounter each other, synchronistic events begin cascading around them. They keep almost meeting. They have mutual friends they never knew about. They discover they were in the same places at the same times throughout their lives. They find inexplicable connections that seem to violate the laws of probability. Jung experienced this personally when he met certain individuals who would become central to his psychological development. He noticed that before these encounters, his dreams would shift. Symbolic images would appear that he didn't understand until after the meeting occurred. It was as if his unconscious was preparing him for an encounter that would fundamentally alter his psychological but trajectory. Here's what's truly profound about Jung's discovery. These synchronistic meetings aren't happening to create pleasant experiences or fulfill romantic fantasies. They're orchestrated by the psyche's drive toward wholeness. Every soul carries within it both conscious and unconscious elements, developed and undeveloped aspects, integrated and rejected parts. When two souls are meant to meet, it's because each carries something the other needs for psychological completion. Jung called this the principle of compensation. The psyche is always seeking balance, always moving toward integration of opposite forces. When you meet someone who feels like a missing piece of yourself, Jung would say you're encountering an external representation of your own unconscious potential. They embody qualities you need to develop, shadows you need to integrate, or aspects of yourself you've never fully claimed. This is why these encounters feel so simultaneously attractive and threatening. The person represents everything you could become, which means facing everything you currently are not. They trigger what Jung called the individuation process, the journey toward becoming your complete, authentic self. But individuation requires destroying who you thought you were to become who you really are. It's psychological death and rebirth. No wonder these meetings feel so intense. Jung discovered that we each carry within us an inner image of our psychological complement. He called this the anima in men and the animus in women. These are archetypal patterns representing the undeveloped aspects of our psyche. The anima represents a man's inner feminine qualities like intuition, emotion, and receptivity. The animus represents a woman's inner masculine qualities like assertiveness, logic, and directed action. When two souls are meant to meet, one often carries the living embodiment of the other's anima or animus projection. A man encounters a woman who perfectly represents his inner feminine ideal. A woman meets a man who embodies her unconscious masculine pattern. The recognition is instant and overwhelming because they're meeting an external version of their own inner completeness. But here's where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. This isn't about finding someone to complete you. It's about recognizing what you need to complete within yourself. The intense attraction isn't really to the other person, it's to the undeveloped aspects of your own psyche that they represent. They're a mirror reflecting your own psychological potential back to you. This explains why these profound connections often begin with projection and idealization. You see in them everything you've been seeking. They seem to possess qualities you desperately want to experience. They feel like the answer to your deepest longing. But Jung understood that this initial projection phase is just the beginning of a much deeper psychological process. The real work begins when the projections start to withdraw. When you realize they're not the perfect embodiment of your inner ideal, but a complex human being with their own shadows, limitations, and unconscious patterns. When the initial enchantment gives way to seeing them clearly. This is when the true purpose of the meeting reveals itself. Jung observed that these destined encounters serve to constellate what he called a transcendent function. This is the psyche's ability to bridge opposites and create something entirely new from their union. When two souls meet who are meant to catalyze each other's growth, they create between them a third thing. A relationship that becomes its own living entity with its own wisdom and transformative power. This transcendent function operates through what Jung described as the tension of opposites. Each person represents different psychological polarities. One might be more introverted while the other is extroverted. one more thinking-oriented while the other is feeling-oriented, one more developed in their masculine aspect while the other has integrated their feminine nature. The creative tension between these differences generates the energy needed for psychological transformation. But this process isn't comfortable or easy. Jung warned that when two souls are meant to meet, they often trigger each other's deepest wounds and most defended complexes. They push each other toward growth by activating everything that needs healing. They become what Jung called agents of individuation for each other, catalyzing psychological development that might never occur in isolation. This is why these profound connections often involve periods of intense conflict and separation. Each person is being forced to confront aspects of themselves they've spent lifetimes avoiding. The other becomes a mirror reflecting back their unintegrated shadow material. They see their own unconscious patterns played out in the relationship dynamics. They're forced to take responsibility for psychological material they've projected onto others their entire lives. Jung understood that this mirroring process serves the psyche's fundamental drive toward consciousness. Everything unconscious seeks to become conscious. Every rejected aspect of self wants integration. Every shadow element desires acknowledgement. When two souls are meant to meet, they create between them a psychological laboratory where this essential inner work can unfold. The meeting isn't really about the relationship in the conventional sense. It's about what the relationship constellates within each individual. It's about the psychological material that gets activated, the growth that gets catalyzed, the consciousness that emerges from working with the projections and recognitions that arise between them. Jung discovered something that will fundamentally change how you understand these destined encounters. The soul doesn't just seek completion through meeting its complement. It seeks what he called the union of opposites within a single consciousness. When two souls are meant to meet, they're participating in an ancient alchemical process that transforms both participants at the deepest levels of being. This process unfolds through what Jung observed as predictable stages. First comes the initial recognition. That moment of impossible familiarity when you look into someone's eyes and feel like you're looking into a mirror of your own soul. Your unconscious immediately recognizes something it's been seeking, something that feels like coming home after a lifetime of exile. But Jung warned that this initial recognition is often followed by what he called psychological inflation. You begin to believe this person is special beyond all others, that your connection transcends ordinary human relationships, that you've found your other half. This inflation serves a purpose. It generates enough energy and fascination to override your ego's natural resistance to the profound transformation that's about to begin. The inflation phase can't last because it's based on projection rather than reality. Eventually, you start seeing the actual person behind your projections. They have flaws, limitations, unconscious patterns that disappoint or even repulse you. This is when many people conclude they made a mistake, that this wasn't the special connection they thought it was. But Jung would say this disillusionment is exactly where the real work begins. What you're experiencing isn't the failure of a perfect connection. It's the withdrawal of projections that were never about the other person anyway. You're being forced to reclaim the psychological material you placed onto them. The qualities you thought they possessed so perfectly, you must now develop within yourself. The completion you sought through them, you must now create through your own inner work. Jung called this the stage of psychological differentiation. You begin to separate what belongs to you from what belongs to them. You start taking responsibility for your own projections, your own unconscious expectations, your own unmet psychological needs. This process is often painful because it requires giving up the fantasy of completion through another and accepting responsibility for your own wholeness. But here's where Jung's teaching becomes truly transformative. He discovered that souls who are meant to meet don't just trigger each other's individual growth. They participate together in what he called the creation of the symbolic life. Their connection becomes a living symbol of the union of opposites that each must achieve within themselves. Think of it this way. Your relationship becomes a laboratory where you both experiment with integrating polarities that have been split in your individual psyches. If you're overly mental, they might embody the emotional intelligence you need to develop. If you're too passive, they might represent the assertive energy you must claim. If you avoid your shadow, they might mirror back exactly the dark material you need to integrate. This symbolic dimension explains why these connections often feel larger than life, why they seem to carry archetypal weight and significance. Jung realized that certain relationships serve as containers for collective psychological processes. Through working with your individual projections and recognitions, you're participating in humanity's broader evolution towards psychological wholeness. The relationship becomes what Jung called temenos, a sacred container where psychological transformation can safely occur. Within this protected space, both souls can risk vulnerability, face their shadows, integrate their projections, and develop aspects of themselves that might never emerge in isolation. The safety comes not from the absence of conflict, but from the shared commitment to using every difficulty as material for growth. Jung observed that these transformative connections often involve what he termed mutual shadow work. Each person becomes a specialist in seeing and reflecting the other's unconscious material. They develop an uncanny ability to trigger each other's deepest wounds and most defended complexes. This isn't cruelty, it's the psyche's precise intelligence working to bring unconscious material into consciousness where it can be integrated. Your partner becomes expert at pushing the exact buttons that activate your core complexes. They seem to know intuitively how to bring up your abandonment issues, your control patterns, your hidden insecurities. Meanwhile, you find yourself unconsciously activating their deepest wounds and most protected vulnerabilities. Jung saw this mutual triggering as evidence of the psyche's remarkable intelligence in orchestrating growth. But shadow work in these destined connections goes deeper than individual psychology. Jung discovered that certain souls meet to work with what he called collective shadow material. They're not just healing their personal wounds. They're participating in the healing of ancestral patterns, cultural shadows, even species-wide unconscious material that gets constellated through their individual relationship. This explains why these connections often feel like they carry the weight of generations. Why working through your individual patterns somehow feels like you're healing lineages of trauma. Why the growth you achieve together seems to ripple out beyond your personal lives into the collective field. Jung understood that individual psychological work and collective healing are intimately connected. The souls who meet in these profound encounters often discover they're working with complementary pieces of the same larger psychological puzzle. One might carry the wound while the other carries the medicine. One embodies the question while the other represents the answer. Together they form a complete symbolic system that serves both individual and collective transformation. Jung also recognized that these destined meetings often involve what he called the transcendent function operating between two psyches. This creates something entirely new that belongs neither to one person nor the other but emerges from their psychological union. It's as if their combined consciousness gives birth to insights, creativity, and wisdom that neither could access alone. This transcendent function explains why these connections often feel creatively generative. Ideas flow more freely. Insights emerge spontaneously. Each person seems to catalyze the other's creative potential in ways that feel almost magical. Jung understood this as evidence of the psyche's natural tendency to create new forms of consciousness through the union of opposites. The work these souls do together often extends far beyond their personal relationship. They might find themselves called to create something together that serves the collective. Art, healing modalities, teachings, or innovations that seem to flow through their connection rather than from either individual. Jung saw this as evidence that certain relationships serve transpersonal purposes. But perhaps Jung's most profound insight about destined soul meetings was this: the ultimate purpose isn't to create a perfect relationship. It's to use the relationship as a vehicle for each person's individuation. The connection serves to constellate within each individual the very psychological material they need to become whole. The meeting between destined souls operates through what Jung identified as a precise psychological mechanism. When you encounter someone your soul recognizes, you're not just meeting another person. You're meeting an external manifestation of your own psychological completion. They carry in their being the exact qualities, energies, and potentials that your psyche has been seeking to integrate. This recognition happens below the threshold of conscious awareness. Your unconscious immediately identifies in them the missing pieces of your own psychological wholeness. The attraction you feel isn't really to them as a separate individual. It's to the aspects of yourself they represent that you haven't yet claimed or developed. They become a walking, breathing symbol of your own unrealized potential. Jung discovered that this process operates through what he called psychological compensation. Your psyche is always seeking balance, always moving toward integration of opposite forces within your personality. When you meet someone who embodies your psychological complement, it's because your unconscious has recognized an opportunity to encounter these undeveloped aspects of yourself in living form. Alone. This explains the overwhelming intensity of these encounters. You're not just attracted to another person. You're being drawn toward your own completion. The longing you feel is actually your soul's recognition of what it needs to become whole. The person serves as a catalyst for your own psychological evolution, triggering growth processes that might remain dormant for lifetimes without this specific activation. But Jung understood that this initial phase of projection and recognition is just the beginning of a much more complex psychological journey. The real transformation begins when you start to withdraw these projections and claim the qualities you've been seeing in them as aspects of your own potential. This process requires what Jung called active imagination and conscious participation in your own development. The soul meeting serves to constellate what Jung termed a complex. This is a cluster of psychological energy organized around a central theme or archetype. When you meet someone your soul recognizes, you're activating complexes within yourself that have been waiting for this exact trigger to emerge into consciousness. These complexes carry both tremendous creative potential and significant challenges. Jung observed that souls who are meant to meet often share what he called a constellation pattern. Their individual psychological structures fit together in ways that create a larger symbolic system. One person's strengths complement the other's growth areas. One person's conscious development matches the other's unconscious potential. Together, they form a complete mandala of psychological possibilities. This constellation creates what Jung described as a psychological field between them. Within this field, both individuals experience accelerated growth, heightened intuition, and access to psychological material that would be difficult to reach alone. The field operates as a kind of amplifier for consciousness, making visible patterns and potentials that normally remain below awareness. The field effect explains many of the seemingly magical qualities of these connections. The uncanny synchronicities, the ability to sense each other's emotional states across distance, the dreams that seem to communicate between them, the insights that emerge simultaneously. Jung understood these phenomena as evidence of the psyche's capacity to operate beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness. But perhaps most significantly, Jung discovered that these soul meetings often involve what he called a mutual initiation process. Each person serves as an initiator for the other's psychological development. They guide each other through transformations that neither could navigate alone. This mutual initiation creates bonds that transcend ordinary relationship categories. The initiation process typically involves facing what Jung called the shadow together. Each person helps the other see and integrate aspects of their personality they've rejected or denied. This shadow work is essential for psychological wholeness, but it's often too threatening to undertake alone. The soul connection provides the safety and motivation necessary to face these disowned parts of self. Jung noticed that these relationships often involve cycles of separation and reunion. The intensity of the growth being catalyzed sometimes requires periods of distance to integrate what's been activated. These separations aren't failures of the connection. They're natural rhythms of the psychological process unfolding between them. Each reunion brings deeper recognition and more conscious participation in the transformative work. During separation periods, each person processes individually what was constellated through their interaction. They integrate insights, heal wounds that were brought to the surface, and develop capacities that were awakened through their connection. When they reconnect, They meet at a new level of consciousness, ready for the next phase of mutual development. Jung understood that souls who are meant to meet are participating in what he called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. This alchemical term describes the conscious effort to transform base psychological material into gold. These relationships serve as laboratories where this transformation can occur through the dynamic interaction between two committed participants. The work requires what Jung termed holding the tension of opposites. Instead of choosing sides or trying to resolve differences, both souls must learn to contain paradox and allow new forms of consciousness to emerge from the creative friction between polarities. This capacity to hold tension is essential for psychological maturity and spiritual development. Jung observed that these profound connections often activate what he called the religious function of the psyche. The relationship becomes a vehicle for encountering the sacred, for touching dimensions of reality that transcend ordinary experience. This spiritual activation doesn't necessarily involve traditional religious forms. It's more about awakening to the numinous quality inherent in psychological transformation itself. The religious dimension explains why these connections often feel like they have cosmic significance, why the growth occurring between them seems to serve purposes beyond their individual lives, why their work together feels like it's contributing to something much larger than personal happiness or fulfillment. Jung saw this as evidence of the psyche's inherent connection to transpersonal dimensions of reality. These soul meetings also serve what Jung called the transcendent function within each individual. This is the capacity to bridge conscious and unconscious, rational and intuitive, personal and collective dimensions of experience. Through working with the projections and recognitions activated in the relationship, each person develops greater access to their own wholeness. The transcendent function allows you to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without losing your center. You can see yourself through your partner's eyes while maintaining your own viewpoint. You can experience their emotional reality while staying connected to your own feelings. This expanded awareness is essential for psychological maturity and authentic relationship. Jung discovered that souls who meet in these profound ways often share what he called a common symbolic language. They understand each other's dreams, recognize the same archetypal patterns, and communicate through images and metaphors that carry deep personal significance. This shared symbolic vocabulary for accessing becomes a vehicle and integrating unconscious material. The symbolic communication operates below rational discourse. It's as if their souls speak directly to each other using a language that bypasses mental interpretation. This direct soul-to-soul communication allows for transmission of wisdom, healing energy, and transformative insights that couldn't be conveyed through ordinary conversation. But Jung emphasized that the ultimate purpose of these destined encounters isn't to create permanent partnerships or conventional relationships. The purpose is individuation. Each person uses the connection as a vehicle for becoming more completely themselves. The relationship serves psychological development rather than the other way around. This orientation prevents the common mistake of trying to preserve the relationship at the expense of growth. When you understand that the connection exists to serve each person's individuation, You can allow the relationship to evolve naturally rather than forcing it into conventional forms. You can honor what's being catalyzed between you without needing to control how it manifests. Jung noticed that souls who truly understand their destined connection often develop what he called conscious love. This is love that includes shadow, embraces imperfection, and serves the highest development of both individuals. Conscious love doesn't seek to possess or control. It creates space for authentic expression and mutual transformation. Conscious love operates through what Jung termed differentiated relatedness. Each person maintains their individual identity while creating genuine intimacy. They can be deeply connected without losing themselves. They can support each other's growth without trying to direct it. This differentiated connection becomes a model for psychological maturity. The development of conscious love requires what Jung called withdrawal of projections. You must reclaim the qualities you've been seeing in them as aspects of your own potential. You must take responsibility for your own wholeness rather than expecting them to complete you. This process transforms romantic idealization into spiritual recognition. Jung understood that when projections are withdrawn consciously, what remains is genuine appreciation for who the person actually is, rather than who you needed them to be. This authentic seeing creates the foundation for mature love that can withstand the challenges of real relationship while continuing to serve both people's psychological development. These destined soul meetings ultimately serve what Jung called the opus magnus, the great work of psychological transformation. Through conscious participation in the process activated between them, both souls contribute to the evolution of consciousness itself. Their individual growth serves collective development in ways that extend far beyond their personal lives. Jung would say that if you've recognized yourself in this teaching, if you've felt that impossible familiarity with another soul, you're not experiencing romantic fantasy. You're participating in the universe's most sophisticated method of psychological evolution. These meetings aren't accidents. They're appointments your soul made before you were conscious enough to remember. Trust the process, embrace the transformation, and remember that the ultimate purpose isn't finding someone to complete you, but using their presence to complete yourself.